Most people believe trouble announces itself. A raised voice, a broken bottle, a punch. Real trouble rarely does. Sometimes, it walks through the front door, smiling. On a cool Thursday night just outside Las Vegas, an old roadside diner buzzed with ordinary life. Coffee cups clinked against ceramic plates. Country music drifted softly from an old jukebox near the entrance. Truck drivers laughed over late dinners. A young waitress hurried between tables carrying steaming burgers. Nothing about the place suggested that, within the next 20 minutes, nobody inside would remember what they had ordered, because every single person would be watching one table. Table 7, the booth by the window, where Mike Tyson sat alone. Mike liked places like this. No velvet ropes, no photographers, no expensive menus, just good coffee, good food, and people who minded their own business. After years of interviews, television appearances, and public attention, quiet places felt like luxury. He had driven almost an hour after visiting an old friend who lived outside the city. Instead of returning straight to his hotel, he pulled into the parking lot after spotting the glowing red neon sign. Maggie's Family Diner. Open 24 hours. Exactly the kind of place he loved. He wore faded jeans, a black hoodie beneath a brown leather jacket, an old baseball cap pulled low. Nothing about him screamed celebrity. He preferred it that way. The waitress smiled warmly. Evening. Mike smiled back. Just one. She grabbed a menu. Booth or counter? The booth's fine. She led him toward the back. Table 7. Right beside the window. Perfect. He ordered grilled chicken, mashed potatoes, black coffee. Simple. As always. Across the room, an elderly couple quietly shared pie. A father helped his little daughter color a children's menu. 3 truck drivers argued about football. Everything felt peaceful. Mike leaned back. Sometimes, he wondered whether life would have been different if boxing had never found him. Maybe he'd own a small business. Maybe he'd raise pigeons again. Maybe people would pass him on the street without recognizing him. He wasn't sure. But tonight, he wasn't thinking about championships. He was enjoying the silence until the front door slammed open. Every conversation inside the diner paused. Only for a second. 7 men walked in. Not because they were loud, because they wanted everyone to notice them. The first man entered confidently. Early 30s. Expensive leather jacket. Heavy gold chain. Confident smile. The kind of confidence that depends entirely on who's standing behind you. 6 others followed, laughing loudly, pushing each other, ignoring the hostess, ignoring everyone. The waitress sighed quietly. She recognized them immediately. So much for a peaceful night. She whispered beneath her breath. Mike noticed. What? She forced a smile. Nothing. But her eyes said otherwise. The man leading the group was known around town as Rico Alvarez. People called him King Rico. Mostly because he insisted they did. He controlled nothing, owned nothing, built nothing. But he had convinced enough young men that acting fearless was the same thing as being respected. Every weekend, he chose a different restaurant. Not because he wanted dinner, because he enjoyed watching people become uncomfortable. Managers gave free food just to make him leave sooner. Employees avoided eye contact. Customers quietly paid their bills. That was entertainment to him. 7 people, Rico shouted. Best table. The waitress smiled politely. I'm sorry, sir. We're almost full tonight. You'll have to wait just a few minutes. Rico looked around slowly. Then his eyes stopped. Table 7. Mike Tyson's booth. 1 person. 4 empty seats. Rico smiled. There. We'll take that one. The waitress immediately shook her head. Sir, that table's occupied. So, he's 1 person. We're 7. The truck drivers looked down at their food. The father with his daughter quietly reached for the check. Everyone knew what was coming, except Mike. He hadn't even turned around yet. Rico began walking toward table 7, each step louder than the last. His friends followed, still laughing, still making jokes. Mike continued stirring his coffee. Without looking up, he heard them. But he wasn't interested. Rico stopped beside the booth. You using all these seats? Mike slowly looked up. Calm eyes. Relaxed expression. No. Rico smiled. Good. We are. Without asking, one of the gang members pulled out the chair opposite Mike and sat down. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, four strangers had surrounded Mike's table. The waitress hurried over. Sir, you can't. Rico raised one finger without even looking at her. We're talking. She stopped. Not because she wanted to. Because experience told her arguing only made things worse. Mike looked around the table. Then back at Rico. You guys hungry? Rico laughed. Nah. We just like your table. Mike nodded slowly. I can see that. One of Rico's younger friends leaned closer. You got a problem? Mike calmly picked up his coffee, took one sip, then answered. No. I was just wondering. What? If this is really the best way you know how to introduce yourselves. Silence. Then laughter. Not from Rico's group. From one of the truck drivers. He couldn't help himself. Rico turned sharply. The truck driver immediately looked back down at his plate. The laughter disappeared. Rico looked back at Mike. You think you're funny? Mike smiled slightly. Sometimes. I think you're sitting at the wrong table. Rico leaned forward. No. You are. Mike's smile didn't disappear. Neither did his calm. And that, for the first time all night, made Rico uncomfortable. The diner had gone unusually quiet. Not because anyone had been threatened. Not because anyone had thrown a punch. Because everyone could feel something building. The waitress stood frozen beside the coffee station. The cook stopped flipping burgers long enough to peek through the kitchen window. Even the little girl who had been coloring moments earlier looked up from her crayons. Every pair of eyes drifted toward table 7. Mike Tyson calmly set his coffee cup back onto the table. The soft clink against the ceramic saucer sounded louder than it should have. Across from him, Rico leaned back with the confidence of a man who believed the room belonged to him. So, Rico said with a grin, you always eat alone. Mike shrugged. Most nights. That sounds lonely. Mike smiled. Only if you don't like your own company. One of Rico's friends laughed. Another rolled his eyes. Rico smirked. You got jokes. Mike nodded. Sometimes. You think you're clever? No. I just don't think every conversation has to be a fight. That answer irritated Rico more than an insult would have. He wasn't getting the reaction he wanted. Normally people became nervous. Some apologized. Others stood up and left. This man did neither. He stayed exactly where he was. Calm. Relaxed. Almost impossible to read. The waitress finally gathered enough courage to walk over. Sir. She looked at Rico. I'm going to have to ask you to let the gentleman finish his meal. Rico didn't even look at her. Instead, he reached across the table. Without asking, he grabbed one of Mike's French fries. Then, another. He smiled while chewing. Pretty good. A few of his friends laughed. Mike watched him for a moment, then quietly pushed the basket closer. If you're hungry, eat. The laughter stopped. That wasn't the response anyone expected. Rico frowned. You serious? Mike nodded. Food's cheaper than pride. For the first time, one of the younger men looked embarrassed. He quietly put the fry back onto the plate. Mike noticed. He didn't say anything. The waitress looked completely confused. She had expected yelling. Instead, she was watching one man refuse to let another control the mood of the room. Rico leaned closer. You know what your problem is? Mike looked up. No. You don't know who I am. Mike answered almost immediately. You're probably right. And I don't think that's important. Another uncomfortable silence settled over the table. The truck drivers exchanged glances. One whispered, this guy's either crazy, or he knows something we don't. Rico laughed loudly. You know what I do? Mike shook his head. No. I run this part of town. Mike took another sip of coffee. Congratulations. The sarcasm was almost invisible, which somehow made it even sharper. Rico slammed his palm against the table. Coffee rippled inside the cup. The little girl near the window jumped. Her father immediately pulled her closer. Mike looked toward them, then back at Rico. His voice remained exactly the same. Easy. You're going to scare the kid. Rico turned. He noticed the child watching. For just a second, he looked uncomfortable. Then the feeling disappeared beneath another smile. I'm not the one scaring people. Mike replied quietly. No, you are. One of Rico's friends finally spoke. Boss, maybe let's just eat somewhere else. Rico ignored him. His pride had already taken over. He wasn't trying to win anymore. He was trying not to lose. There's a difference. Mike knew it well. He'd spent years inside boxing gyms watching young fighters make the same mistake. Once ego enters the room, logic usually leaves. Rico folded his arms. You remind me of my grandfather. Mike smiled. Was he a good man? Rico laughed. No. He thought people should respect him because he got old. Mike slowly nodded. My grandmother used to say something different. Oh yeah. Mike looked directly into Rico's eyes. She said, if someone has to demand respect, they usually haven't earned it. The sentence hit the table like a brick. Nobody moved. Nobody laughed. Even Rico's closest friends stared at him instead of Mike. One quietly looked down at his drink. Another slowly shook his head. The confidence they'd walked in with was beginning to disappear. Near the entrance, 2 police officers walked past the diner windows. The waitress instinctively looked toward the door. Relief spread across her face. One of the truck drivers noticed. Should we wave them in? The waitress hesitated, then looked back toward table 7. Something stopped her. Not fear. Curiosity. She wanted to know how this ended. So did everyone else. Rico suddenly stood. His chair scraped loudly across the floor. He leaned both hands on the table. Now only inches separated him from Mike. You think you're teaching me something? Mike remained seated. No. I'm hoping you learned something. Rico laughed. I could make one phone call. Mike nodded. I'm sure you could. I've got people everywhere. I believe you. You ain't impressed? Mike looked around the diner, then answered softly. I'm impressed by fathers taking care of their kids. I'm impressed by the waitress working a double shift. I'm impressed by the cook back there who's probably been standing for 12 hours. He paused. But threatening strangers? That stopped impressing me a long time ago. Silence. Complete silence. Even Rico's own friends avoided looking at him now. One of the younger guys finally whispered, Boss, I think we should go. Rico snapped. Shut up. The young man immediately looked away. Mike noticed. He recognized the expression. Fear. Real fear. Not of him. Of Rico. Mike sighed quietly, then looked directly at the young man. What's your name? The teenager looked surprised. Ethan. You in school? Yeah. What grade? College. What do you study? Mechanical engineering. Mike smiled. Good. Finish it. The young man blinked. What? Finish school. Don't spend your best years trying to impress people. Rico slammed the table again. Talk to me. Mike slowly looked back toward him. I was. The room fell silent once more, because everyone had just realized something. This wasn't about Mike Tyson anymore. It was about Rico losing control. And the more he tried to control the room, the more respect he lost. At that exact moment, the elderly cook stepped out of the kitchen. He had worked in the diner for 32 years. Quietly, he walked to Mike's table, placed a fresh cup of coffee beside him, looked at Rico, then smiled. This one's on the house. Mike thanked him. The cook nodded, then looked at Rico. You boys still planning on ordering? Or are you just borrowing our furniture? A few customers laughed. This time, nobody tried to hide it. Rico's face turned red. The room was no longer on his side. Rico looked around the diner. Nobody was laughing anymore. Not his friends. Not the customers. Not even the waitress. For the first time that night, he felt alone. He looked back at Mike. You think you're better than me? Mike smiled gently. No. I just think tonight can end better than it started. Rico shook his head. You still don't know who I am. Mike looked at him for a moment. Maybe. but I know exactly who you're trying to be." That sentence hit harder than Rico expected. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. One of his friends quietly whispered, "Boss, let's go." Rico ignored him. He leaned closer. "You really ain't scared?" Mike answered honestly, "I've been scared many times in my life. I've just learned not to let fear decide how I treat people." The room fell silent again. Just then, an older truck driver stood up from his booth. He walked over with his check in one hand. He looked at Mike, then smiled. "Mr. Tyson, I just wanted to say thank you." The entire diner froze. Rico frowned. "Tyson?" The truck driver nodded. "Yeah. Mike Tyson." For a second, Rico thought he had heard wrong. He stared at the man sitting in front of him. Mike slowly removed his baseball cap. The famous face tattoo became visible. There was no doubt anymore. It really was him. One of Rico's friends whispered, "Oh, we're dead." Another quietly backed away from the table. The youngest guy looked completely embarrassed. Rico swallowed. His confidence disappeared instantly. You're really Mike Tyson?" Mike nodded. "Yeah. But that's not the important part." Rico looked confused. Mike continued, "If I wasn't Mike Tyson, would the way you treated me have been okay?" Nobody answered, because everyone already knew the answer. The waitress walked over with the bill. She placed it on the table. Before Mike could reach for it, Rico picked it up. "I'll pay." Mike looked surprised. "You don't have to." Rico shook his head. "I know. I want to." He took out his wallet and paid for Mike's meal. Then he turned toward the waitress. "And everyone else's coffee." The waitress smiled. "I think they'd appreciate that." Rico looked back at Mike. "I'm sorry. Not because you're Mike Tyson. Because I acted like an idiot." Mike stood up. He extended his hand. Rico hesitated, then shook it. Mike smiled. "That's the strongest thing you've done tonight." Rico lowered his head. "I've got a lot to work on." Mike nodded. "So do we all." As Mike walked toward the exit, the little girl from the corner booth ran over. "Excuse me." Mike turned around. She held out a small piece of paper. "I drew this." It was a simple drawing. A man sitting at a table. Another man standing beside him. Above them, she had written in crooked letters, "The good guy." Mike smiled. "Thank you." He folded the drawing carefully and placed it inside his jacket pocket. Then he looked back one last time. Rico and his friends were quietly helping the waitress move tables back into place. No shouting. No laughing. No pretending. Just 7 young men cleaning up the mess they had created. Mike smiled to himself. Sometimes, the biggest victory isn't knocking someone down. It's giving them a reason to stand up and become better. He pulled his cap back on, walked into the cool Las Vegas night, and disappeared into the crowd. Inside the diner, people would talk about that evening for years. Not because Mike Tyson threw a punch, but because he proved something far more powerful. Real strength doesn't need to be loud. Sometimes, it simply finishes its coffee, stands up, and walks away.